Hey, HannahMouse1 here. Welcome to part 3 of my series, Fixing Your Scratch Projects, where you send me your projects and I show you how I would polish them off. In this video, I'll be making over River Jumper by GameMaker33 after a quick poll on my Discord told me that you wanted to see an endless runner. So if you want a say in what I make, I would highly recommend you joining the club. And if you want to see your project appear in this series, there is a submission form also in the description. As for this project, it certainly needs a lot of polish. The biggest issue is that for the life of me, I can't seem to get the player to jump, making the game more than a little difficult. And there are some issues with the platforms overlapping, which looks a bit messy, and I just feel like it could use some sprucing up visually. I started by going through and deleting any scripts that already existed to give myself a bit of a blank slate before creating the art for an infinitely scrolling river. This is comprised of 2 clones, each with a different costume that creates a seamless loop. This meant making sure that the art for the bottom of each costume lined up perfectly with the top of the next. For the art style, I decided to go for a cartoony style with bright colours and lots of gradients for shading, kind of inspired by the visual style of Subway Surfers, as I believe that game was an inspiration for the original River Jumper project. The biggest difference being that Subway Surfers uses 3D assets and I'm of course working in 2D, this being Scratch. And then I made the art for the first type of platform, a small log. The platforms in the original felt a bit disjointed, with logs, planks, life buoys and god knows what else. So I decided to streamline things down and settled on making everything jungle themed. And I animated the log to look like it's churning up the water behind it as it floats down the river, before implementing the code behind their generation. I coded it so that there's a constant flow of rows of logs with 1 to 3 logs per row. Doing it like this means that you're never in a situation where there are no logs to move to, and also so that the logs don't wind overlapping, and also so that the logs don't wind up overlapping with each other, which looks a bit messy. And the longer the game goes on for, the faster the log generation and movement is. And then I created the art for the player, who I designed to look like an explorer from the top down. I animated them running and coded it so that they can appear and move around the screen, switching to the correct animation, facing the correct direction as they do. The original game used the arrow keys for movement, which I did keep, but I also added WS and D controls, as that's how I personally prefer to control games, and presumably there are other potential players in the same camp as me. I also made it so that you can jump, creating an animation for this as well, and I made it so that if you either go below the bottom of the screen or fall into the water, the game ends and the platforms and player disappear. And in order to round off the primary gameplay loop, I made the game over screen, which I designed to look like the flowing river with an explorer's hat floating in the water to indicate that the player has met a less than fortunate fate. There's a wooden sign that proclaims game over, and getting the letters to look like they're curving around the rounded logs was fun, let's say. And then I went through and made sure that the death code all worked, with everything disappearing that needed to and switching to the game over screen. I then started adding variety to the platform generation, starting by adding in larger logs. These are functionally the same as the small logs we already have, except they're twice as long. Modifying the existing art for these was super easy. And for the code, the only slightly difficult thing was making it so that once it spawns, the second tile it occupies is also considered blocked, so another platform can't spawn in that space and thereby overlap. But I managed to figure it out and get it working as I wanted. The next platform type I added was the crocodile, and how this works is that it is something to avoid landing on. I really struggled with the art for this. Evidently I don't know how to draw crocodiles from above, but I managed to get something acceptable, I'd say. And for the generation, I had to make sure that any row of platforms of the crocodile has at least one other platform as well, to make sure that the course is always navigable. And I had to make it so that the player dies if they're touching the crocs. I then added in boat sections, which is basically just bits where you can hop in a boat and rack up points for a bit. It's something common enough in most of these endless runner style games, and I wanted to add something like that into this. I made the art for the boat, and for the generation it had to spawn a boat in the center of the row and then have a few rows without any platforms, and then a complete row of small logs where you'll disembark from the boat. It was a bit fiddly, but I was able to MacGyver the code that blocks the spaces in the big logs generation code to create the empty space after the boat, and then I had it run a check to see if the next generation has to be a complete row, and if so, it gets those logs all spawning in. I also had to make it so that the player can actually get in the boat, so I made it so that the boat detects if it's touching the player and then tells the game that it's now in boat mode. I made an animation of the player sitting in and rowing the boat, and because that's all housed in the player sprite, the boat platform has to disappear until the player disembarks, when it appears in the water behind the player. And I made it so that the player switches to the boat rowing animation and doesn't die from falling in the water when they're using a boat. And the final type of platform I added was the cracked plank. These are pieces of wood that break away if you stand on them for too long, and for these I needed to create a version of the sprite at like 4 different levels levels of crackage, so to speak. So the plank at base, then starting to break away, then really cracked and so on. And the art for this, it wasn't hard, and I wouldn't even call it tedious per se, but it did really take quite a long time to do. It was quite detailed and was a bit fiddly. Getting these to spawn in though was super simple. There's just a chance for them to spawn in the place of the small logs, and I coded it so that if it touches the player, an internal counter counts down, and when it hits 0, it progresses the plank onto the next level of degradation, or the plank disappears if it's at the final stage. I then modified the end screen to have a space to display your score, and I also made a restart button. Of course, you could already restart the game by just hitting the green flag, but not having an inbuilt replay button always feels a little bit amateur. So I created that and made it so that it appears on the game over page, and so that clicking it restarts the game. Next, I made it so that there's actually a way to earn points, so to speak, and the way you'll do that is by collecting coins. My thought process behind this is that you're some sort of Indiana Jones-esque treasure hunter, collecting these rare Aztec coins or something. So I made the art for the coins and added those onto one platform per row, with there being a chance to spawn 2 on some platforms if you're lucky. And I created UI to display the score both in the gameplay section and in the game over screen, coding it so that it repositions onto the correct platform when it switches to the latter. I also coded it so that in the boat sections there's a constant stream of coins for the player to collect, and so that the player can actually collect the coins when they touch them. I then went through and added in a load of sound effects. This is key for the experience in any game. There are sounds for events, I guess you'd call them, such as being eaten by a crocodile, collecting a coin, or getting into or out of a boat. And there are sounds that play on certain frames of the player's animation, like a footstep sound when you're running, or a splash sound on each row of the boat's oars. And then there's just a passive river sound that plays constantly through the game. For sounds like the coin pickup sound that you're going to be hearing a lot in quick succession, I added in a little bit of pitch shifting to make sure that it's not quite so annoying over time. I also made a backing track for the game in Soundtrap, and this is one of the only times where I felt really limited by the instruments available in the free version. I'd have loved to have some of the percussion drums and things to make a proper Aztec-y jungle style themed piece, but I had to make do with what I had, and I think I made what I'd almost describe as a modernized version of a jungle theme. And either way, I'm pretty happy with what I came up with, even though I'm far from a musician and my method of writing a melody is to slam my fingers across the keyboard and to try and salvage something workable from whatever ear assaults that leaves behind. And then I added the finished track looping in the background of the game, and for a quick last minute addition, I added in some other types of collectible to spawn in the place of the coin on occasion, and these reward the player with more score depending on the rarity of the item, just for a bit of variety. And the very last thing I had to do was to turn the title screen into a thumbnail for the game, and all this had to do was to hide when the game starts code-wise, and this marks the game as complete. I'm super happy with how this came out. It's fairly standard as endless runners go, but I certainly think that it's an improvement on the original. I mean, you can actually jump for a start. But apart from that, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. Like and subscribe if you did. It lets me know that there's something to see more of. Join the Discord link down below, as is the submission form if you want to submit your own project for this series. And I'll see you next week in another video. Bye!